sangre, patria muerte, venceremos.
On the 30th anniversary of his revolution, Fidel Castro stood before the crowd in Revolutionary Plaza to celebrate a revolution filled with promise and expectation. Risking his reputation and revolution, he chooses to condemn the events and changes shaking his former allies who have turned from socialism. Now the longest ruling non-democratic leader alive, opinion of Fidel Castro and his revolution remains as divided and as passionate as ever.
The Cubans say, we're free. We're free of illiteracy. We're free of polio. We're free of malnutrition. We're free of hovels and shacks. It's true.
The Cuban economy is in a shambles because the only person that can make economic decisions for the country is Fidel.
These Castro brothers are big, powerful, charismatic, magnetic men who are used to being in control, and in fact have been in control for quite some time. And everyone, although it's certainly a benevolent dictatorship in that everyone loves them, and it's not a question of people being forced to do things.
But what Castro put in the minds of the Latin American people is like a dream of a different world, a different kind of country, a little country that have power enough in their own people to defeat anybody in the world.
There are two faces of Cuba. One is real, the other a dream. Why then, after 30 years, should perceptions remain so divided? To answer that question, we embarked on an unusual trip to Cuba. We brought Margaret Kemper with us, formerly Margaret Trudeau. She had met the Cuban president in a highly publicized state visit when she was the wife of Canada's Prime Minister.
I think the adventure in Cuba started when I was asked to be a journalist involved in a documentary on Cuba with the hopeful possibility of doing an interview with Fidel Castro. Having met him some years ago, I knew from the time that I had met him that I had a friend in Fidel, and I'd certainly be able to, if it were possible, to say hello to him again.
We were told every movement we would make in Cuba as journalists would be controlled and we would be accompanied everywhere. We landed at Varadero, the Cuban holiday resort. But instead of staying in Varadero that night, as expected, we drove on to Havana, hoping to escape the controls of Cuban security. By night, one of the Western Hemisphere's oldest cities looked attractive and European. But by morning, its shocking decay was evident everywhere. Managing to elude the Cuban security police, we went in search of what was old and what was new. We'd been told that Havana had been neglected, forgotten. That mistake was now being corrected, we were assured. If so, we saw no evidence of it. What we did see was a city without commerce, but there was no malnutrition, no beggars, and daily life seemed safe and orderly. There were lineups for bread, which was rationed. There was a visible scarcity of goods, all goods. Since Castro's fallout with Gorbachev, even more stringent rationing has been enforced and efforts to halt Havana's widespread deterioration have been postponed. Once a lively city of great beauty and life, only the large exhibition center, given to Cuba by the government of Canada, and the huge communications tower of the Russian embassy, built in friendlier times, are among the few examples of new construction. The large, luxurious old houses in the residential district of Miramar had been turned into embassies, general offices, or schools. When we returned to our hotel, representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had caught up with us. We were told to remain where we were and await instructions. Fidel Castro was disturbed, we were told, that we hadn't made proper plans, particularly since Margaret Kemper was with us. Later that evening, a government Mercedes picked us up and took us to a house on the grounds of the presidential palace. The driver was carrying a .45 automatic. The house came complete with servants, a cook, and a pool in luxurious, well-maintained grounds.
In cities like Havana or Varadero, there is a number of houses, a zone designated for official guests. This zone is very closely controlled by the G2 Cuban counterintelligence services. All these houses have listening and tape devices to control all the movements of the official guests.
Daniel Iglesias was a Cuban dissident recruited by Cuban counterintelligence. For 7 years, he worked as an agent of Cuban security before defecting in 1985. He lives in Spain.
I was approached by an officer of the military counterintelligence service, and he told me that I had a very interesting legend, good political background, that could be used for counterintelligence and intelligence activities. And from the very beginning, I started to be trained in the city of Varadero on how to detect possible intelligence activities among journalists that went to visit Cuba.
From now on, what we saw and when we saw it would be determined by our Cuban hosts. We were now on the official tour. Rafael, our principal guide and controller, was to accompany us at all times. He had seen service in Ethiopia and was a member of G2, the Cuban equivalent of the KGB. As he put it, I am more than I appear. He showed us the revolution's proudest achievements. Daycare, public health services, and education. All of these, we were told, were personal concerns of Fidel Castro. Dr. St. John of the World Health Organization.
Data collection systems. Their healthcare services cover 100% of the population now. There is access to health care in Cuba. You can't say that for the entire population of countries like Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and other poor countries. In fact, about 130 million people in this hemisphere do not have regular access to health care. In Latin America and Caribbean, do not have regular access to health care. But Cuba, everybody does.
Dr. St. John was to discover there was literally no price tag.
They said, well, the way it works in Cuba is we will prepare the program. We will submit that program up the line in the Ministry of Health. It'll be a complete package, no budget. And if the activities are approved, if the program is approved, it's done. We don't have to calculate the budget. And the program was approved and it was done. And nobody knows the cost of it, at least I don't.
Jose Luis Jovio was a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Finance. He defected in 1981.
From 1966 to 1977, Cuba had no budget. There was no money relation between the enterprise, and the only money that was circulating was the population money. And Fidel ruled the country all these years without any kind of budget, without knowing if a factory was profitable or not, if it lost money, or if it gained money. Nobody knew anything.
Manuel Sanchez Perez was Deputy Minister of Finance until he defected in 1985. 5 days later, Cuban agents attempted to kidnap him in the streets of Madrid.
That Castro had handled the Cuban economy like a personal farm. Really, so it's sometimes you think it's crazy, but it's true. So he says, the type of cows that we have is not good. We have to change it. And then we begin an incredible plan that cost $1 million to change the type of cows that we have, you know? And at the end, it's no good, because it's good we have a new type of cows, but they need a type of food that we don't have in Cuba.
Our next stop would be the Empresa Conadara in the Valley of the Picadors. Ramon Castro, Fidel's older brother, was president of the Empresa, a ranch of 125 square miles. The chief purpose, indeed the only purpose, of this vast estate was to introduce the superior qualities of the Canadian Holstein into Cuban cattle. Since the Revolution, $5 billion was spent to import and feed 35,000 head of Canadian cattle to achieve this end. We were taken to a laboratory where we were to discover from Dr. Rodriguez the Canadian Holsteins at the Empresa were housed in air-conditioned barns, and after 20 years of experimentation, the new cows did not give any more milk than the ordinary Cuban cows with which they had begun. Suddenly we had a visitor, the man in charge, Ramon Castro. Ramon took us to the highest point of land in the area and showed us his handiwork, reaching as far as the eye could see. But Ramon gave us a different reason for why there were no cows in the field at mid-afternoon.
Entonces aquí tenemos animales importados de Canadá, pero están ahora en las casas en el ordeño.
We have animals here that have been imported from Canada, but they are now being milked. They are inside.
Before us stretched acres of empty fields and man-made lakes, built for an experiment which, by the most charitable assessment, had not worked, and at worst was a dismal failure. Here, as with daycare, medicine, and education, the pattern of investment did not seem based on any principle, not even Marxist-Leninist principle, but rather on the personal interests of the Castros. The Empresa was Ramon Castro's toy. The regime had already declared the project a victory, and the Canadian Holstein cow merits a place alongside the Cuban freedom fighter in the pantheon of the revolution. In the early 70s, desperately seeking ways to improve the economy, Cuban officials presented Castro with a plan to reopen and rebuild Cuba's tourist industry. Manuel Sanchez Perez recalls the discussion that occurred.
And when we talk about tourism as the only choice that we really have to have a good development, Castro turned himself and asked our Minister of Security of KGB, the Cuban KGB, asked him, well, how many people can we control? Can we have under control here? And he asked 250,000. Well, why you say that? Well, he analyzed 250,000, how many per month was that, where they can go, how he can put all the controls that we make for all the tourists. And then he say, well, this amount of people is reasonable for us to have under control. And be sure that they are not in the streets and talking with people and something like that, you know? And then Castro turned to the people and said, that's the amount that we are going to allow to come here, not one more.
Tourism was seen as a potential threat to revolutionary values, A vast network was set up to ensure that all visitors were carefully controlled.
There was also the question of security. The driver of the car was a member of the security team, and the person from the foreign ministry who was then assigned to us never would leave us, because that was the nature of their understanding of taking care of a guest, was to make sure that they were with them every second. Really controlling our trip, controlling our every move.
Every hotel in Cuba has a security officer that works full-time in the hotel. He controls the net of informers that every hotel has. Whenever a tourist is targeted, the maid that is in charge of making up his room, she'll be asked to make a list of the things, of the suspicious things that tourist has brought with him. Also, if the tourist has a notebook, she will look for any address of Cuban people that tourist might contact in his visit to Varadero.
Fidel Castro's obsession with security and control imposed limits, and tourism failed to improve Cuba's economy.
The Cuban economy is in a shambles because the only person that can make economic decisions for the country is Fidel. I consider Fidel a very good politician for foreign policy. But I consider that Fidel does not know anything about economics. And he has ruled the country only with what he wants to do. And he has a lot of crazy adventures in the economic field.
The Soviets are not able to give so much like they gave in the 70s. And Cuba, with this system, is not able to produce more. So you have a very big contradiction there, and you will see that the things are bad and are going to be worse in the next years.
The truth for Fidel is his truth, not other people's truth. So when he believes in something, he believes that that is the salvation of the Cuban economy, and nobody says anything. Everybody is afraid to say anything.
In 1960, the U.S. embargoed all trade with Cuba. The Soviet Union soon became Cuba's major trading partner, importing Cuban sugar at prices nearly 3 times world levels. For years, Castro personally and often arbitrarily directed Cuba's economy. Immediately after the revolution, a major objective was to end Cuba's historical reliance on sugar exports. Substantial investments were made in an attempt to diversify the economy. In 1969, all this was suddenly reversed. Overruling his advisors, Castro launched a campaign to increase sugar production to an unprecedented 10 million tons.
We have said it here, not 1 pound less than 10 million tons. That is the point, and we must stress it. It will be an unbelievable shame if we were to fall short of the 10 million tons.
So during this 10 million harvest in 1968, 69, and the beginning of the 70s, Fidel put all the resources of the country for making the 10 million tons of sugar. And the country was almost paralyzed. The restaurants were closed, almost all of them. The theaters were closed. The bars that were closed. The cabaret that were closed. And it was the worst year of the revolution since 1959 because of the 10 million harvest. And everybody knew that it was Fidel's fault, and nobody said anything.
Si ustedes quieren que le diga con toda claridad la situación, es sencillamente que...
If you want me to tell you the truth, it is simply that we will not make the 10 million tons. I am not going to beat around the bush. I believe that for me and for all Cubans, this is painful to say.
And the Soviet knew perfectly that the 10 million harvest was going to be a failure. But they decided to wait until the year 1971, 1972, where the country was really in a very bad economic shape, and Fidel visited the Soviet Union in December 1972. At that moment, they signed the famous Secret Accords.
Castro has been more dependent since 1970, where the Cuban economy was totally destroyed with the experiments. So he had to go to Moscow and say, I need a lot of help. And then the Soviets told him, well, if you need help, we can give you, but you have to accept some conditions.
In the 1970s, Fidel Castro had become economically dependent and far more integrated in the Soviet camp. What occurs in the 1970s, though, in contrast to the 1960s, is that you have much more of a convergence, a growing convergence between Cuban and Soviet interests. And these interests ultimately converge in Southern Africa.
The militarization of Cuban life has been the revolution's most notable achievement. Nearly 75,000 troops, military, and security advisors were sent to 17 African countries. The largest Cuban presence is in Angola, where Cuban troops kept the government in power for nearly 15 years.
The most important reason for Fidel to get involved in countries as far as Angola, Ethiopia, in other countries, because Fidel wanted to play a first-class role in the international arena. And he wanted to be an actor where the United States and the Soviet Union and all the countries can negotiate with him.
General Rafael del Pino is the highest-ranking Cuban officer to defect. This is his first television interview. His voice and appearance have been altered for his protection. In coming to the U.S., General del Pino left behind a life of privilege.
If I stayed in Cuba, I would have had many privileges. Also, all of my family would also have been privileged. But if I stayed, I would have had to close my eyes, close my ears, and become the murderer of my own conscience, kill my conscience. Then I'd live like a tree. And a man cannot live like a tree.
As commander of the Cuban Air Force in Angola, General del Pino found that there was little support for the war among his troops.
The soldier in the field, the junior officer, the new generation's officer, and even I am a general. We condemn that war, and we all think that that's a terrible and unjust war.
For revolutionaries to fulfill an internationalist mission is something that is considered a great honor, and that should not make anyone feel strange about it. When people have motivation and when people have ideals. Of course, that implies sacrifices. It implies sacrifice for family, as they separate from their relatives for a certain period of time. In some cases, it means risks. Undoubtedly, it means sacrifices. But our people can carry on these missions because they are prepared to do so.
I know that in the last 3 years, we have had 56,000 deserters in the regular army, an army of 200,000.
The people understood that when you have to stay with military force 10 years in a place and you are not fighting anymore with the white South Africans, you are fighting against black people of Angola. And everybody that comes again say, I don't know what are we going to do there. And so everybody had the feeling that we can't win. And everybody has the feeling that if we go, it's going to be a disaster for the government of Dos Santos, no? So I don't want to make comparisons because I don't have the whole information, but the people in Cuba say Angola is our Vietnam.
After more than 15 years, the Cuban commitment in Angola is drawing to a close. A U.S. negotiated settlement is ending Cuban and South African involvement, but the Civil War itself is undecided. Cuban troops are coming home to a stagnant economy without a victory.
I think this will have major repercussions within Cuba. It will mean that 11 years, 12 years, whatever, of involvement in Angola, of suffering Cuban casualties, of other sacrifices, will have been in vain. It will mean the return of upwards of 40,000 Cuban military and civilian personnel to Cuba, to an economy that cannot now absorb those people.
But now it's not only the danger that he can be wounded or he can dead, that it's high probably that he comes infected with this terrible AIDS. But with 40,000 people in Angola with no healthy conditions in Angola, because you can't have in the jungle good healthy conditions, I think that Cuba is going to have in the next years very big troubles with AIDS.
During the war, 300,000 Cuban troops served in Africa, where AIDS became a major health crisis. But General Del Pino says no warning was ever given. Even the Cuban Air Force commander was kept in ignorance.
At that time, we were told nothing about AIDS. We really did not know that such a disease existed.
AIDS was brought home by Angolan veterans, creating an extensive health problem in Cuba. All Cubans who test positive for the AIDS virus are incarcerated, most in Los Cocos, a military facility near Havana. Cuba is the only country that imprisons its AIDS victims.
What if someone tests positive? What happens to them?
They are isolated in the military hospital at Los Cocos.
For how long?
Well, until they die.
There are many institutions in Cuba used to control the population. The most effective are the block committees, called Committees for the Defense of the Revolution.
Well, there are people who live where you live. The problem is you live in a building. And come one of the parties and say, oh, we need that you this year will be the president of this committee. You know? Well, you can say no. That's a lot of things that can happen, and you say, well, I better do it. And when you do it, if you don't do it well, then you receive a bad evaluation too, a bad point. So you have to do it, and then you have to do it well. And you are 1 year, the other one, your neighbor is next year, the other neighbor will be the other year, and at the end, everybody is part of, like I told you.
What are the responsibilities? What does the committee do?
They have several tasks, but the fundamental one is the night watch, to keep under control the enemies of the revolution, block by block.
Tony Bryant is an American who spent 12 years in Cuban prisons. He escaped, but before he was recaptured, he hid out in Havana.
And so for the first time, I had the opportunity of walking down the streets. And I had the experience of walking and being analyzed every block by their block committees, their CDR, the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. These are homes where they have clearly visible on every city block in Cuba and all out in the countryside. They have a house with a big sign, CDR, Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And these people are there to watch you. Each block, if you come into a block, this one picks you up and he watches you until you get to the next block. Then the next one picks you up and he watches you. And this is 24 hours a day. You're being under observance and being watched. It's Big Brother watching every move that you make. If you go into a house and you remain too long, you don't live there, everybody knows it, the police will be called and you will be arrested. It was a frightening feeling to be stripped over and over and over, block to block.
Are you aware of the criticisms that have been made outside Cuba of committees such as this one?
Yes, there are many people in the world who are not able to analyze the importance of a CDR among the population of a country. The importance of creating this kind of organization that gives opportunity to every citizen to participate in the daily life of its own country.
There are no privileges, then there are no privileges that go with membership.
Que si existe algún tipo de privilegio para los miembros del CDR, porque sean miembros del CDR. Ninguno. There's no privilege whatsoever.
A member of the CDR has a number of duties. First of all is watch the behavior of his neighbors and report on that. The more active you are in the CDR by informing, the best you will be considered. Because if you want to, whenever you apply for a job, or you apply for university or high technical school or holidays, there's always a commission that will go to your CDR and ask for information about yourself. So if you receive negative information, you have to forget about it, about your application. The positive information is only possible if you demonstrate that you are an active member of the CDR.
Are there any enemies of the revolution left in Cuba?
Yes, of course there are still enemies of the revolution, of our revolution inside the country. And that's why we still keep the CDRs working on.
With such tight controls, the opportunities for free expression are few. One opportunity presents itself on December 16th and 17th during the Feast of St. Lazarus. Realizing the religious festival had never been broadcast before, we pressed our host to take us to the procession as an example of the regime's religious tolerance. Nothing prepared us for the massive crowd assembled. All had to walk a minimum of 3 miles to the small church of St. Lazarus. Some crawled that distance, while others walked all the way across Cuba. The crowd turned the event into a demonstration of independence. Hundreds of thousands joined in the procession. Why? As one Cuban put it, they came to be themselves. It's the only time in Cuba when they can do that. Another said, the people have no hope and they cannot express themselves. They cannot vote for their leaders, go on strike, or say, I do not like the way I live. You cannot do that in Cuba. The repression and stagnation, the lack of opportunity, and the prospect of a dismal future forced many Cubans to take desperate measures to escape. They came by boat and raft, risking their lives, even floating on inner tubes. In 1 year, tens of thousands came fleeing to the United States, seeking a new life in Florida, where they now number more than 600,000. Knowing that 90 miles away, opportunity and freedom exist, Cubans continue to search for ways to escape. In urgent need of cash, Castro found a way to prey on the desperation of his citizens. Along with Panama's former dictator, Manuel Noriega, the Cubans devised a plan to bring Cuba millions of dollars per year. A complex international smuggling ring was set up. A top-ranking Cuban intelligence officer was sent to Washington to oversee its operation. Operatives in the U.S., Cuba, and Central America were put in place to sell Cubans their freedom and smuggle them into the United States. To reveal how this works, we targeted Carmen Hernandez, one of the chief agents operating in Miami. The U.S. government was unaware of her operations. For 8 years, Maria Arias tried to get her son out of Cuba. We offered to buy her son's freedom through Carmen. We enlisted Maria's help to penetrate the smuggling operation.
Of course, why not?
What we have here is a radio mic, and what I'd like you to do is we'll put this on you.
Maria agreed, and she set up the first meeting with Carmen. We provided her with a body-packed transmitter, which she hid under her clothes. We staked out Carmen's house.
I will be able to send him a visa in Cuba. We'll fix up all his problems. I have some other commitments with people who will be able to get him very quickly out of Cuba.
But how is it possible to get out of Cuba?
Sí, pero ¿cómo es posible salir de Cuba?
Ahora, en estos momentos, por los dólares.
Only by money.
The price Carmen quoted was $7,000. The first payment of $3,500 was prepared, the serial numbers noted, and the money given Maria.
Thank you.
The next day, Maria returned to Carmen's house with the money. During the meeting, Carmen made it clear that she had worked for the Cuban government and had powerful friends in Panama. Carmen signed a receipt for getting Maria's son to Panama, and she promised Maria he would be home within 2 months. As the months passed, Maria waited and wondered whether her son would ever go free. During the long wait, Maria gained Carmen's trust, answering Carmen's phone when Carmen went to Panama.
Hello. Carmen.
Then, one day, the call came. It was from the man the Cubans sent to Washington to assist the smuggling operation.
De Ramón. Sí, García.
Ramon Garcia is a consular official in the Cuban interest section in Washington. He has diplomatic status. Carmen told Maria Garcia was a colonel in the espionage service of Cuba. After waiting nearly 1 year, Maria's son finally got permission to leave Cuba. He boarded a Cuban plane to Panama. At the airport in Panama, immigration officials seized his Cuban passport. Then a member of Carmen's network escorted him through Panamanian immigration and drove him to a Panama City safe house. 10 days after Maria made the final payment, her son was driven to the airport. He was given a false Honduran passport with his own picture and a ticket to Mexico City in the name of Pereira. Through Carmen's contacts, Maria's son was smuggled through Mexican immigration and flown to the Mexican border town of Reynosa. The next day, he was driven to within 10 yards of the heavily patrolled U.S. border. That night, he crossed the Rio Bravo and illegally entered Texas on a raft. The following day, with the help of a lawyer who worked for Carmen, Maria's son filed a request for political asylum that failed to mention his illegal entry into the U.S. That afternoon, he was flown from Houston to Miami. Carmen picked him up. Maria and a member of our crew was told to go to Carmen's office. It would be a long wait. As Carmen drove up, it was apparent she was delivering more than Maria's son. To our surprise, Carmen had with her 3 additional Cubans she had smuggled past the U.S. authorities. That night, there were tears of joy in Maria's home. The combination of Maria's son's evidence, her phone records, and our surveillance tied Ramon Garcia and the Cuban government to the smuggling ring. At this point, we brought the Department of Justice into the picture. Perry Rivkind is the Director of Immigration and Naturalization Service for Florida.
With the evidence that you have given us, we will investigate it, in fact, immediately. It's going to be a very high priority because this is a very significant and apparently far-ranging type of smuggling operation.
As a result of our program, Senator Kennedy called for a federal investigation.
Well, it's obvious a human rights issue because you've got a government selling people, and that is about as corrupt and as immoral as you can get.
Castro's dream lives on for many people, including Margaret Kemper, who met with Castro off camera.
He's as when I met him 12 years ago, he's an extraordinarily charismatic and magnetic man. He's in the peak of health still. I guess he's now 61, so his beard is very white, but he's as strong and tall and essentially charismatic.
The propaganda of Castro was a very good one. And you can put facts in the mind of the people, and people can understand that they are facts. For example, they know right now that in Cuba there is no liberty, and that in Cuba they have a lot of prisons and so on. But what Castro put in the minds of the Latin American people is like a dream of a different world, a different kind of country, a little country that have power enough in their own people to defeat anybody in the world. So at the same time to be a wealthy country and a free one. That is the dream that Fidel Castro put in the minds of the Latin American people. But a dream is very difficult to eradicate from the mind of the people. That is why it is very difficult for Latin American people to believe that Castro was wrong and have done wrong to us, because at the same time, they have to destroy their dreams.
El día en que yo me muera, vendrá la espuma caliente, cantando un pregón de oriente, para mi muerte rumbera. Llévenme para allá, aquí no, que va, llévenme para allá, aquí no, que va.
In December, we brought together a group of 40 ex-political prisoners. Between them, they had spent a total of 640 years in Cuban prisons. While imprisoned, they were beaten, and many suffered torture. Bound together by the struggle to maintain their humanity, they turned inward, seeking solace in writing poetry and in God. For some, this reunion would be their first meeting since leaving Cuba's prisons.
Que voy a andar sin descanso, tendré una cruz vagabunda, si mi tierra no me enfunda, ni me acuesto en su remanso. Prométanme los soldados, roto este muro de hierro, no dejen en el destierro mis huesos abandonados. Llévenme para allá, aquí no, que va, llévenme para allá, aquí no, que va.
Querían expresar la realidad.
What was the crime that, for which you were condemned?
Yes, they said that I was the support, and I had hidden in my monastery a man who had hijacked a plane and killed the pilot, and they accused me to hide it in the monastery.
Had you hidden him in the monastery?
No, it was not true. I knew something about this man, but in a special way. But I couldn't talk about this. I couldn't because I'm a priest. I was not allowed to talk about this in that moment. Se empleaba en el contexto cristiano primitivo y era la palabra ágape, que es esto mismo que estamos haciendo, es decir, compartir algo.
Then they kick you, and you enter the double guard, the double line of guards. They began to beat you and to destroy all your clothes.
Tear your clothes off.
Yeah, and beating you at the same time. When you finish here, you were all completely naked, without nothing, even shoes. So they give you a uniform, but to some of them, they even give nothing to them. They put them in the cell naked, completely naked. So they enjoy, because a woman feels very embarrassed when he's naked in front of a group of men, and there were a lot of men. So it's a way of humiliating a woman.
And while lying there on that stripped cell, I decided to write a poem for Fidel Castro. And for all of those tyrants who exist around the world. Fidel Castro is constantly talking about the new man that the revolution creates, and he inadvertently has already created the new man in the political prisoner, you see. Those who have moral, those who are strong, those who have dreams, men and women of valor. He's already done that. He's failed in his endeavors to create the monsters that he wants and the robots that he wants, but he's created already the new man, you see.
I remember once, we were in La Cabaña and seeing this wonderful food you just had. I see the plates here. I remember that a friend of mine, I used to call him ICP. We went to the dining room or the mess hall, and there a whole spoon of something white and boiling that we had 3 minutes to eat, and it tasted like cardboard. And he asked me, Mongo, what are we eating? He says, well, never mind, don't ask me, eat. Eat it and take the bread. Because we must eat. I'm gonna burn my mouth, my tongue, but eat it, even if it's hot, eat it. You have to eat it. They give us 3 minutes, and then we have to stand up and leave the rest. The next day, I tried to find out what it was. Impossible. It was not cornmeal. No, it was nothing close to cornmeal. But then Isepe told me, Mongo, why don't you go to the kitchen? You know, just infiltrate yourself like the communists do and try to find out what they're giving us. So I went in the kitchen. And to my surprise, there were a stack of sacks way up to the ceiling that said, Chicken Feed Canada.
Were you mistreated in the prison?
Oh, yes. Like many other companions. I think that I'm not an example of a man who has suffered a lot. I know lots of friends and companions that have suffered much more than me. But I have been mistreated very hard.
You've been beaten?
Oh, yes, beaten many times.
El primer año en la cárcel lo consume la tristeza. Ya después el hombre aprende y ve la vida con certeza.
When I wake up I have like 3 or 4 cockroaches in my hands. Kill it. So you feel so nasty, you know, so dirty, because you have anything to clean your hands. So all the time you feel dirty because of the cockroaches and the black water over there and the rats going out. So you feel so really bad that you prefer to die.
Al partir del tercer año, lleno de oprobios y azotes, el amor tiene el tamaño de un gigante entre barrotes.
We have suffered a lot for nothing. We have put a lot of faith for nothing. Few little things, and the future is very uncertain.
25 años, Dios. Un cuarto de siglo es. Protesten las primaveras. La madre, el sol y el poder.